Welcome to the Flock and Hive podcast, a place for curious minds to explore all that makes life so weird and wonderful. And this week,
It's funny. So they pinpointed wormwood as being the root of all evil, of why absinthe made you go mad. But nobody seemed to question the fact that wormwood was still being used in vermouth. So vermouth comes from the German word for wormwood, vermut. So things just didn't quite add up.
We talked to Allison Crawbuck about absinthe.
hello, and welcome back to the Flock and Hive podcast. We've got another boozy one for you today.
It's all about absinthe and the myths surrounding it.
And busting those myths, actually, which is a bit sad in a way, I think, because there's a lot of romanticism around the myths, I think.
Yeah, so why are we doing it then? Leave it alone.
Well, for me, it was just so interesting because I work in booze, as you are well aware of, and I got this press release about the Absinthe Parlour, which is located at the Victor Wind Curiosity Museum. And Devil's Botany is the London Absinthe Distillery, and they have the bar there where they serve all sorts of absinthes, but also their own. And so I wanted to get in touch with the founder, Alison Crawbuck, to see if she could basically give me a masterclass, and therefore us a masterclass in absinthe, and tell us all about it, really, because there's so much rubbish surrounding the history of absinthe, isn't there?
Yeah, well, when you mentioned that one of these episodes was going to be about absinthe, I was just racking my brain for, well, my only association is just drinking some vile green stuff at 2 a.m. in nightclubs in the early noughties, which clearly wasn't absinthe, but was called it. And obviously the association with Van Gogh's Psychosis. So I had quite negative connotations about its potency.
Yeah, well, I think most people have. Most people still think it's gonna get you properly fucked, don't they? Well, we'll hear from Alison about why that's not necessarily the case. I've had a completely different idea about absinthe to you, which again just shows what a pretentious person I am, I think. Coming from like studying French and Italian, I really fell in love with that Belle Epoque era, particularly in Paris, where all the artists and all the writers and all the poets were literally living together, a lot of them in the same place, the Bateau Ivoire, right in Montmartre. But we're talking about Picasso, Braque, Guillaume Apollinaire. But then there's also, as you mentioned, Van Gogh and Ernest Hemingway and Oscar Wilde. All these people drank absinthe, and because they were bohemian and because they were artists, and because it was that era, particularly in France, where it went off the scale popular, I've just got in my head those, lots of lovely plush red velvet and gold high ceiling cafes where they'd all sit and smoke gitane and create amazing works of art, and I really have that association with the romanticism, with the romantic part of it. But there is the thing about hallucinations as well, to be fair. I'd kind of glossed over that bit, I think.
Well, it was an amazing time that produced so much important work, writing, artwork that has informed the whole world and that has inspired artists to this day. So it is romantic, but is that the absinthe? Or is that actually this amazing work that was arguably would have been done without it?
Yeah, I mean, very good question. But it's the whole absinthe is part of that whole aesthetic of the Belle Epoque, and
Yeah.
that's why I'm fascinated by it. But then its darker side as well. Who doesn't want to know more about that?
Yeah. And also the makeup of how you're drinking it is very, closely linked. Well, it is a botanical spirit, isn't it? So it draws from botany and herbalism, and that, gives it another bent, which makes it not just about the alcohol, but about, the creation of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we're going to detail that during the chat with her as well. I mean, there's so much to love about it, and there's just so much to, I think, make people aware of with its history as well. Anyway, I feel like I'm rambling in an incoherent way, um, which makes me think, funnily enough, of the word of the week.
What is it?
Well, I've kind of given away what it is. But a word that came up this week, which I thought would be a good one to remind ourselves of, is maundering. So I'm maundering here. It's when you are rambling, you can't string a sentence together, which, thank God for editing. Let's just say that for these podcasts. But maundering is often due to confusion or intoxication, especially if you're drunk to the point of potential hallucination.
So it is mostly drunk rambling.
Drunken rambling, yes. Lost in one's thoughts when in a drunken haze, which is quite a romantic way of putting it.
I know. That again, it's all about the spin. And we as we go on to talk, don't we, later on about romanticizing and how language can just change how, whether you would even try a drink at all. But maundering essentially is repetitive, annoying drunken people.
Yeah, yeah, it totally is. But to your point as well, I'm going to do the cheeky shoehorning in another word because I find it a really beautiful word, but its meaning actually isn't so. Ultronius, do you know that?
Sounds like a Harry Potter spell.
Exactly, it does, doesn't it? And it's spontaneous in a way that seems unexpected or a bit odd, but as if someone were suddenly under the influence of something hallucinatory.
So it's a pretty word, but kind of sounds a bit like a psychotic episode that suddenly descends.
Yeah, almost like Harry Potter got his wand out and went, Expecto Ultronius, and then suddenly the person, it was like they'd had 16 pints of absinthe,
Oh,
essentially.
right. So, like, what's the word? What's it when you've got a ghost in you? Possessed.
Possessed. When
So,
you've got a ghost in you.
no, it just sounds like kind of an instant possession.
Yeah, that is very Harry Potter. Maybe J.K. Rowling should be listening to this podcast. She might learn a thing or two for her next book.
But she's been cancelled, hasn't she? So, bit orcs.
Yes, orcs. Oh my god, cancel culture though. That is a subject that perhaps we could have another time, but not now. Now, in fact, is probably the perfect time to speak to Allison Crawbuck. Here's what she had to say. Allison Crawbuck, I am so excited to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was brilliant to pop into the Absinthe Parlour last week and to hear everything you had to say. You blew my mind with all the myths you busted and the history, which I've always had a bit of a fascination for. Just it's partly because there's so much mystery surrounding it, partly because of the artwork and all of those things. So why don't we dive in and do exactly that right here? So first of all, can you tell us about the Absinthe Parlour, Devil's Botany, yourself, why you're doing this, and why absinthe?
Yes, so it's a fun connection. Actually, you mentioned the art, and my background actually is in art and art history. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I studied art history in my master's. I worked as a director of an art gallery before moving to London. So I was very much drawn to absinthe originally because of its connection to art and literature. Then I moved to London about 10 years ago, started working in the hospitality industry, and that is where I met my partner Reese, and he and I opened the Absinthe Parlor in 2016. So the Absinthe Parlor is located in the Victor Wynd Museum of Curiosity. So for anybody that hasn't been there before, it's inspired by a Victorian cabinet of wonder. So think lots of curiosities hanging from every corner of the rooms. And when opening a bar there, we knew that it was important to create a drinking experience that would hold up to the collection. So we had lots of customers coming to visit. They were, of course, enchanted by the marvels that hung from the ceilings, unicorns, fairies, like that sort of collection. But we wanted them to also walk away remembering a really special drinking experience that complemented that cabinet of curiosities. So we knew that absinthe was a perfect fit. And we started focusing on absinthe right away. We started doing lots of research. Again, my art history background, I'm like, yes, get me to the books. I want to know, what were people drinking? How were they drinking it? And why. We started traveling and meeting with some incredible producers in France and in Switzerland that were really keeping that spirit alive during the ban. And we were importing their absinthe as well to share at the Absinthe Parlor. So we ended up collecting the largest list of absinthe available in the UK, which we still have now. There's about 30 on our menu now, including many others that are just waiting for some shelf space. So it's a really special cocktail bar to go to if interested in discovering absinthe, whether on its own or in cocktails. And then, of course, all of this research, we uncovered a newspaper article that said there was going to be an absinthe distillery to open in London. And so this is in the year 1900, and the Brits were not happy about this. So it was received with a public outcry. They were saying, no, we don't need an absinthe distillery. But it gave us the inspiration. We knew that there was never an absinthe distillery to open in London. And if there was going to be anybody to do it, it would have to be us. So in 2020, during the lockdowns, we took the leap of faith and opened the UK's first dedicated absinthe distillery, which is Devil's Botany. And our distillery is located in Leighton in East London. So we've been producing absinthe there since 2020, and all of our absinthes really have a British twist on them and contribute something different to the history that's so interesting with absinthe already.
Can we start by telling people what exactly is absinthe? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around this.
Definitely. It is one of the most widely misunderstood spirits out there, both in the trade and with customers. So, absinthe is essentially a botanical spirit. We call it a cousin of gin, so nothing to be fearful of there, right? We all know and love our beloved gin. It is similar in that you start with a neutral spirit. So for us, we use a neutral grain spirit, but there are places in France that use sugar beet or a grape base. So you start with a neutral spirit, and then you will redistill that spirit with botanicals. So to familiarize it again, like with gin, if you were to distill gin, you would distill it with juniper. If you're making an absinthe, you need to have what's called the holy trinity of botanicals. So that is grand wormwood, green anise, and fennel seed. So you distill your absinthe. You can throw in a whole other mix of botanicals in there too to create your unique flavor profile, but you need to have those three in order for it to be considered an absinthe. And then when you distill it, it will come off the still clear, as all spirits do. And if you wanted to make a green absinthe, traditionally you would then undergo a second maceration process. So you'll use a new mix of botanicals, soak them in that distillate, and then you will have the distillate extract the chlorophyll from the botanicals, so coloring it green naturally. So it's a botanical spirit. It is a spirit, not a liqueur. So traditionally, sugar would not have been added to it in the bottle. It's always added by the absinthe drinker when preparing it. It also was always traditionally naturally colored, naturally flavored. So that's a very important distinction between a quality absinthe or perhaps something that is a little bit more artificial. And then one of the most recognizable aspects of a traditional green, specifically glass of absinthe, is the louche effect. So when you add water to a traditionally distilled absinthe, it will then start to cloud. So the naturally occurring compound in anise and fennel called anethol, it will start to release the oils in the absinthe as it's diluted. So you have this beautiful alchemy in the glass when preparing it.
And wormwood isn't a wood, is it?
No, it is not a wood. It is a botanical. It is a very, very bitter botanical. So on a distillation day, we have to wear masks when preparing the amount of wormwood that goes into it, because it creates this bitter taste in your mouth, even just from getting into the air. It is quite bitter to taste, but when you distill it, it releases a lovely herbaceous floral note in the final distillate. And it is the reason why many people thought absinthe made you go mad, because it was the one ingredient that distinguished it from other spirits being made at the time. And but it's funny. So they pinpointed wormwood as being the root of all evil, of why absinthe made you go mad. But nobody seemed to question the fact that wormwood was still being used in vermouth. So vermouth comes from the German word for wormwood, vermouth. So there was some loophole, some things just didn't quite add up. But yes, and it is also the reason why absinthe has its name. So in Latin, grand wormwood translates to Artemisia absinthium.
Ah, I
Mhm.
didn't actually know that. Okay, so let's talk about why it's got this reputation for hallucinations, etc. Where does that legend come from, and how does that lead to the ban?
So I always like to compare it to the UK having its gin craze. So everybody knows the history of the gin craze here in the UK. In France, they definitely had an absinthe craze. And so this meant that at the time, absinthe was very popular. It was very cheap to buy, and it was being produced without any regulations. So, just like you had bathtub gin causing a lot of problems here in the UK, you had people creating absinthe without the regulations, so they could pretty much sell anything they wanted. So, while there were hundreds of really quality brands of absinthe being produced, there were also some inferior products being put out there. So, that would have caused some problems. This is also a time when hardcore drugs were definitely a bit fashionable and socially acceptable. So, opium dens were a popular hangout at the time. You could get heroin tooth drops for your toothaches just at your local pharmacist. So, there was a lot of stuff going on that, looking back on it now, looks like it could have been a recipe for disaster. And I think that definitely lended itself to people thinking that absinthe made you hallucinate. But I think they were doing a lot more other than just drinking absinthe.
Yeah, yeah, heroin and opium might have had something to do with that. Hmm,
Just a little bit.
hilarious. Blame it on the drink.
Yeah.
Okay. So where did it originate? Because I think a lot of us who don't know much about it sort of have visions of Paris, Picasso and Leonardo da Vinci and like all that kind of stuff. But it's not just France, is it?
No, so actually, the most commonly repeated story when talking about the origins of absinthe is about a French doctor named Pierre Ordinaire who moved to Switzerland, so a region of Switzerland called the Val de Travers, in a small town of Cuvée. And he moved to Switzerland with a highly coveted recipe for the extract of absinthe. So the origins of absinthe, up until recently, has always started from this small region in Switzerland. And this highly coveted recipe for the extract of absinthe would have been used medicinally, but eventually there was a business savvy man called Major Duby who then saw its potential not as a cure all elixir, but as a delightful aperitif. And he opened the first commercial absinthe distillery in Switzerland in 1797. So the origins for the commercial side of it definitely started in Switzerland. Eventually, the iconic brand Pernod Fils would open a distillery in Pontarlier in France in 1815. But this story was repeated time and time again, and we didn't know much else about what happened before that. Where did this extract of absinthe originate from? So we did a lot of research into that, and we started digging through old apothecaries' recipe books. So at the time, you would get your elixirs from local apothecaries who would distill botanical spirits essentially for all sorts of ailments. And in doing the research, we found a recipe for an extract of absinthe that was distilled right here in London, dating back to 1719. So one could say there are origins of absinthe right here in the UK that just haven't quite been celebrated yet.
And you're the person to help us do that. I love that.
Yes.
So for someone who hasn't tried absinthe before, how would you describe the taste?
So the most recognizable flavor that you'll get immediately is from the anise and the fennel. So anise and fennel have an almost licorice-like flavor. So I mean, it is very much that coriander conversation, isn't it? You either love it or you hate it. But so you may know this flavor of anise from drinking pastis, perhaps, or sambuca. The difference being the inclusion of wormwood, of course, but also sambuca and pastis are quite heavily sweetened, where absinthe is not. It gets all of its sweetness naturally from the anise and the fennel. So these are sweet spices that help round out the grand wormwood. But then from there, there's a whole range of different flavors that you can get. So we wanted to really showcase the versatility of flavor that you could find in the category. So, for example, we have our London absinthe, which is very floral and refreshing with like mint and lemon balm, elderflower, meadowsweet, so delicate flavors. And then our absinthe regalis is very herbaceous and spice, so cinnamon, nutmeg, sage, galangal root. So you can get a lot of versatility in the flavor, but the most immediately recognizable flavor is definitely that licorice-like note from the anise and the fennel.
Mhm. And when I tried your more traditional absinthe, it didn't loosh. It didn't go cloudy. Why is that? What's that choice about?
So that was actually our London absinthe
Mm.
that didn't cloud. And so I mean, we've been working with absinthe now for the last 8 years, with the absinthe parlor having opened in 2016. So we've had a lot of time to talk to customers about what they are most excited about, what they're looking for, what they like, what they don't like. So we've taken that on board. We also really wanted to make our mark and show that there is space for innovation and experimentation within the absinthe category. So, for over a century, absinthe has been tied down by tradition. It, in many ways, helps it, it's what draws people to it, but nothing new has happened in the category in over 150 years. So it was important for us to learn from tradition, but then to figure out where there was space for innovation. And particularly, we had the British palate in mind when making the London absinthe. So for this one, it lets the supporting botanicals shine through a bit more. So that meadowsweet, elderflower, lemon balm, peppermint, those sort of delicate notes shine through. So it's a little bit less anise forward. Similar to how in the gin category, contemporary gins made a space for people that don't particularly love the flavor of juniper, but they wanted to get into gin. So you have a contemporary gin, juniper will sort of sit in the background a little bit more and allow the other flavors to come through. So it's a similar thing with our London absinthe. And we made a very bold decision to not have it louche. This is keeping cocktails in mind. So if you're going to make a martini with the London absinthe, you don't want a muddled glass of absinthe in your cocktail. And also keeping the sort of rebellious spirit of the absinthe drinkers in the 19th century in mind as well.
Yes. Can you tell us more about those? I mean, there's such a rich cultural history around this, especially within the arts, as we alluded to at the beginning. Who was drinking this, and what? Tell us about the Green Fairy and all of those beautiful things.
Yeah, pretty much everybody was drinking absinthe back then.
Yeah.
This is what we're always talking about. It was one of the most fashionable drinks at the time. It said that absinthe became the more favored drink over wine in France in the height of its popularity, which of course the wine industry did not love. So, famous absinthe drinkers included Toulouse-Lautrec. Toulouse-Lautrec used to stroll the streets of Paris with a cane that was hollowed out so he could have his own little personal stash of absinthe on the go at all times in it. You have Verlaine and Rimbaud. Their explosive love affair was famously fueled by their shared love of absinthe as well. Van Gogh was a big absinthe drinker, and looking at his bold color juxtapositions on the canvas, perhaps that makes sense from looking at them and understanding that maybe it was an absinthe induced vision that he was trying to portray. Alfred Jarry, he was the founder of the petaphysical movement and inspired many artists like Picasso. He was one of the few who were bold enough to drink their absinthe neat before the ban. And he had a cocktail called the Tremblement de Terre, so the earthquake, where he would dilute his absinthe with brandy.
Dilute.
Yes, I know. Yes, strong stuff. Talking of Picasso, he has an incredible cubist sculpture that I remember going to see at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And it's a deconstruction of an absinthe glass. And it has the spoon and sugar cube on top, and it's an actual absinthe spoon incorporated into a sculpture of an absinthe glass. So he portrayed absinthe drinkers at the time. And I think Ernest Hemingway's description of it is my favorite. So he describes it as a tongue numbing, brain warming, idea changing liquid alchemy.
That's beautiful.
It just sums it up, doesn't it?
Yes. So you said it shouldn't be naturally. I mean, it shouldn't be sweetened, and it shouldn't be neon green. Definitely. So when did it become legal again? And how do people know that they're getting a real absinthe and a legal one?
So, absinthe was banned for almost a century in many countries around the world. It's the only spirit to ever be singled out in a ban, as it was. Of course, America had prohibition of all alcohol, but when that was lifted, they made a specific prohibition of absinthe. And it wasn't reintroduced to the market until fairly recently. So everybody is still reintroducing themselves to it, getting to know the spirit again. That means there were some trials and errors, perhaps we'll say, along the way of trying to recreate it. So early on, there were some absinthes that were produced perhaps without understanding the tradition of how it was made. So they knew absinthe was green, strong, tasted of licorice. So they would make artificially green, strong spirits that were sweetened and tasted of licorice. And so we've definitely moved away from that now, which is very exciting. So there are other producers that are making some really incredible absinthes and keeping tradition in mind. So if you're looking for an absinthe and you don't know where to start or what looks like it would be traditional, if it is green and if it looks as though it is neon, sort of kryptonite color, if this color could not possibly have come from nature, that's usually a good starting point to raise concerns. But other than that, there are some really great absinthes out there to start exploring. And I think the most important thing is to drink absinthe. You know, give it a go, try it. It was made to be enjoyed.
Mm. And how do you drink it? You mentioned cocktails, but there's a traditional way. And what's your favorite?
So the most iconic way of preparing absinthe is definitely with the fountain. And the absinthe fountain is a beautiful design inspired by the Art Nouveau movement, which was fashionable at the time. You would fill the fountain with ice water. You will pour the absinthe in your glass and then balance a perforated spoon on top of the glass with a sugar cube on top of that. And you'll let the water slowly drip over the sugar cube into the glass of absinthe to dilute it. So absinthe traditionally would have been quite high ABV, thinking like 60 to 72% ABV. It was always made to be diluted. So this fountain is a beautiful ritual to dilute, to sweeten, and to chill your absinthe. But not everybody has an absinthe fountain at home. So if looking at the purpose of this fountain was to dilute, sweeten, and chill, we can do that in many other ways. So at home, I love to drink the an absinthe just diluted with soda water over ice in a glass, as you would any spirit. And traditionalists may say that absinthe wasn't enjoyed with ice in the Belle Epoque, but this is really because ice was not readily available. Ice is available today. Every drink is better when chilled. The soda siphon actually was invented in the 19th century as well. So it would have been fashionable at the same time that absinthe was most popular. So it is also a traditional way of preparing it, or you can use it in cocktails. So, of course, our background is cocktails. All of our absinthes were created with cocktails in mind. For the London absinthe in particular, it's really fun to take any of your favorite gin classic cocktails, swap out the gin for the London absinthe for a twist with a different botanical spin. So, as we had the other day, our London absintini, a little absinthe martini. Also, the Clover Club is one of my favorites with absinthe because of the spices with the lemon and the raspberry and the egg white just make it almost like a dessert. So the options are endless.
And I loved that absentini that we had. There was a real texture to it, almost like a creaminess. I've introduced that to my husband. I'm sure I haven't made it quite the way you would make it, but
Oh,
yeah, he's a convert, which is great.
amazing. See?
Tell us about your brilliant cocktail book.
So, another product of the lockdowns, we found ourselves with the absinthe parlor closed for far too long, and we started to get antsy. And in addition to opening the distillery, we launched our cocktail book called Spirits of the Other World. So, this is a deep dive into the history of drinking rituals and their connection to the occult practices. And it was just so fascinating doing the research. So it goes from ancient times through to today, and it definitely mixes our two worlds of magic and mixology.
Yes, and there's some mocktails in there, surprisingly, actually, aren't there?
Yes, of course, of course. I think that people are much more conscious about sometimes swapping out their drink, a couple of times a day, or I mean, a couple of times a week, swapping out a drink for a mocktail or a non-alcoholic option. And also, the mocktails, most of them are connected to alchemy. And a lot of times, the idea with alchemy, you were transforming, base metals into gold and silver, but also transforming your spirit into a more heightened existence. So sometimes the alchemists believed in the abstinence from alcohol. So it lends itself well for a mocktail.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So, what do you think's happening in the market with absinthe sort of globally at the moment, and where's it going to go, do you think?
So hopefully we are seeing a revival that's going to stay. I think absinthe has, it was banned. It then became legal again. And there was, a growing interest, then it was lost again, then a growing interest, then it was lost again. So I think it's very important that we start to look for ways to modernize absinthe for the adventurous drinkers of today. So people looking for something a little bit different, looking for something with a unique story, and that will really help ensure that absinthe is here to stay rather than it just coming and going as it's done so much. And then, yeah, there are some great producers out there, a lot in America, which is very refreshing to see other people taking it on and doing it justice, which is very important. We don't need to hinder its reputation any further. So hopefully that trend will also come over to the UK, and more people start experimenting with it.
And speaking of experimenting, you have obviously more than just your London absinthe. How many different kinds do you make?
So we have the London Absinthe, which is the clear, rebellious one that we mentioned that does not cloud, made for cocktails. We have our Absinthe Regalis, which was inspired by the recipe for absinthe that we uncovered that was distilled right here in London in 1719. So it is traditional and historic, but it is also very bold in its claims of being British. Then we have a chocolate absinthe liqueur, which is just lovely. It's infused with raw cacao, so it's just that subtle hint of dark chocolate that complements the peppermint that's in the distillation of the London absinthe. And that just, you could just enjoy that on its own. So again, how can we offer an absinthe experience without a fountain? This one's already diluted. It's already sweetened for you as a liqueur, and it's just ready to drink, and it's delicious. And then we also have a bourbon barrel aged absinthe, which is really exciting. So, this is a space for us to experiment with different flavor pairings like the chocolate absinthe liqueur, or also production methods. So, by aging it in a first fill X bourbon barrel, it really takes on a lot of the flavor and the characteristics from the bourbon that was in there. And we used a bourbon barrel from a distillery in Brooklyn. So a little connection to my roots. So we have a lovely barrel from Kings County Distillery there, which is just delicious, delicious whiskey.
Gosh, I've seen similar things happen with gin, and the results are so interesting. Texture, color, all of that. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to tasting that one.
Yeah, and the spices in the absinthe really complement the wood and the notes that you get from the wood and from the bourbon, of course. So it's that sort of like sweet spices. You're already getting vanilla from the bourbon and that sort of like lovely maple, but then the anise and fennel with that together, it's just delicious.
Yum. Right. So I think you better tell people where to find you, both online and in person.
Yes. So our absinthes are available online, of course, on our website, but also on Master of Malt and the Whiskey Exchange. And then if you find yourself in London, you can always come down, of course, see us at the Absinthe Parlor, have a glass of absinthe with us. And the bottles are all available to purchase there or at the Whiskey Exchange shops around London, or Clapton Craft shops as well around London.
Fantastic. Well, it's been absolutely brilliant hearing from you again. Thank you so much for joining us, Alison Crawbuck.
Thank you.
So, absinthe, thoughts?
Well, I've had my own associations and understanding of absinthe based on zero knowledge, to be fair. Um, but first and foremost, I love how Alison has this exploration of absinthe purely based on a passion for its history and art history and the culture of the time, and she talks about it beautifully, but with the also like scientific addition of the botany and the botanical element of it, which makes it really beautiful and actually makes me want to have a glass of it, which is ironic because I don't drink spirits.
We see, that's it. It's kind of the point, I guess. But it's the same for, I find, any drink. It's the same for wine. Like the more you know about it, how it's made, but also its history, and especially if there's that incredibly romantic side to it, you get so much more out of that experience. I think. That the fact that there's a green fairy makes it eminently fascinating for me.
Yeah, describe the green fairy element.
Well, absinthe, because of botanicals, which are essentially plants, it has that very, very pale color to it, especially when it louches with the water. And so during that famous time during the Belle Epoque, because people were gathering cafes to drink absinthe with the fountains, and that would be called green hour, l'heure verte. And then, of course, absinthe started to become associated with hallucinations and people doing crazy things. Hence its nickname, the Green Fairy.
And hence it being banned as well.
Yes, quite unfair, obviously. Now we know.
Yeah, especially as you mentioned, Van Gogh, yes, he had some serious psychiatric issues and ultimately committed suicide. And a lot of times that's been sort of linked, and cutting off his ear, of course, was being linked to absinthe, when really, as you mentioned, heroin droplets for toothache were widely available and opium dens.
I
So,
It's like you think it might have had something to do with that potentially, and everything else that was going on and what they were taking. My God.
but it is still important though that it is still a drug, isn't it? Is dangerous just in as much it is to drink too much, regardless of the psychosis and the hallucinating.
When you say that it's a drug, what are you referring to? Alcohol.
Alcohol, yes.
Yes, like pure and simple alcohol, like not the wormwood, which obviously had, I know it's got something in it. What's it? Two Joan, not enough to cause any issues in real world. But yeah, I mean, it's the same strength as gin, like day to
Yeah.
day. Yeah.
But this is the thing, and this is what I find really interesting about this whole conversation, is it's part of a larger conversation about the perception and the branding. Like someone one day just decided absinthe was evil, but gin was okay. And Alison refers to that, doesn't she? Our beloved gin, like we're okay. But this is all based on just what we've been told. And we've had this conversation, haven't we, with Professor David Nutt, and talking about the effects of alcohol, the dangers, and big alcohol, and how the government sell it into us and they will not let it go because it's money making. And it is all about the marketing, the branding. And I do, with no disrespect to the Absinthe Parlour, and I think it has a place and is beautifully delivered and is really, really interesting. It still is promoting quite a deadly drug. And this conversation around it, I find highlights how we can make it, like you say yourself, you find it a really romantic thing. It's a really luxurious, beautiful thing to experience. Whereas, and that is your world. And you can completely convince people of that. Whereas I am, as we all know, on my sober kind of journey, and I don't drink spirits anyway. But the fact that this is quite provocative to me just proves that, how you can kind of be convinced that, this is a good thing, this is a good, whereas it's essentially still alcohol, which is a blight. Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean. And working in alcohol, I have this battle sort of internally quite a lot. Where I come out with it is that I find knowing more about the spirit, about its history and what goes into making it, makes me more likely to respect it and to respect how it should be tasted, and how to have the right amount of it, as it were. Because actually, trying the absinthe fountain with Ali, it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of water in there. It is the antithesis of downing a shot of Jose Cuervo at a bar where you don't know anything about it, so you don't respect it. It's just to get you pissed. Whereas I really find to take my time with something like this now I know more about it. That would be my kind of argument for respecting a spirit. And of course, it's never made to be drunk in massive doses. I know that, especially in this country, we totally abuse alcohol. But I think the explanation and the history goes some way to counteracting that personally. But I totally respect that that's not everyone else's opinion.
But ultimately, it's still quite a dangerous game, even being like, "Oh, but we can do this classily." Do you know what I mean? Because, someone with alcoholism could still sit there and go through all those motions and convince themselves, "Oh, but, it's part of such a special time, and look how I'm respecting the ritual." And that I still think is a sort of dangerous knife edge, but only because of where I am. But respectfully having a different opinion because we have a different viewpoint on it and a
Yeah.
different lifestyle with it, totally.
I get that. I've got a magnet on my fridge that says wine, how classy people get shit faced. And 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 I've seen loads of memes about like a wine tasting, referring to the kind of thing that I do where you'd have like six little tastes in a glass. It's like, it's six glasses of wine and it's called education or something. It's a very good point. It's still alcohol at the end of the day. I would personally just wager that I would rather drink it that way as opposed to being able to buy 3 litres of very shit wine that's just sugar juice and sulfites for about £2.50 in the supermarket, where you don't even think about what's in your glass.
Or even Frosty Jack cider. Do you remember that? Like £1.50 for like 2 litres park bench cider.
Oh, I think I was classier than you. I was diamond white and K cider because K had the black frosted bottle with the red K on it. I mean, what is your experience then with absinthe? Because I've only come across, well, I don't really come across it until now on holiday in Prague, where it was fluorescent green. Didn't taste anything like that lovely fennel fresh note that absinthe should have. In fact, it probably had nothing to do with it whatsoever, other than someone had called it that illegally.
Um, I have a very, very niche lane of my life. It was definitely university, so this was early noughties, where it was like the last one standing in the club, like, let's get the absinthe in. And I just remember mint green, horrendous hangovers, and illegitimate snogging at 3 a.m.
Oh, nice. Oh, I thought you were going to say that you'd done the cane of booze thing, but obviously you're caning in a different way. Ironic, seeing as that is now your name, by the way. So
It is very ironic that I'm looking to cut out the booze, but I'm a caner through and through. But the cane, speaking of the Toulouse-Lautrec's cane of absinthe, is just genius. I have sort of done a version of that. I remember back in the day, late 90s Reading Festival, you can't take alcohol into the arena. So me and my friend Renee, shout out, used to genuinely duct tape cans of cider to our legs because you remember back in those days, our jeans were so baggy. They were
what?
so baggy. I know, it worked. It
Well,
worked.
then I suppose they weren't metal detectors, then, were they?
Yeah, they were nothing. They were just guys who sort of gave you a quick pat down. And to be honest, they didn't even care if they did really find anything. But yeah, we used to be waddling. We must have looked like cowboys, but we were everyone's best friend in the crowd because we'd got to the front. So we had our whole day stash down our legs. And sometimes we'd get generous, flash a leg and give someone a can.
Wasn't it horribly warm?
Yes, but that's the spirit. But remember, I got proposed to with a warm can of Strongbow on a hill at Glastonbury, and that was like the best thing that could have ever happened. So we're in different camps here.
Gosh, yeah. No, there I am going, God, at least you could have found some ice and, maybe a real glass.
Nah.
God, no booze stories. Far too many. Mine mostly involve showing off to boys, throwing eggs at your head, show
Yes,
off.
asshole.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
But going back to regulations again, when Alison talks about it raising concerns if something doesn't look genuine, what are those concerns? That you're just not getting the right experience or that it's more dangerous? Because ultimately, the only dangerous element is the alcohol, which would be in a counterfeit and the norm.
The point of regulations, like in wine again, like in all spirits, is when you have these PDOs, AOPs, those everything that goes on a label, it's so that the customer knows what they're getting. And so there are no surprises, there are no kind of illegal substances in there that are going to do your body like more harm, let's say, than the alcohol that it's going to be is going to be in there. The whole point of it is to keep you safe as a consumer
Right.
and
Okay.
to keep quality up.
And to keep it from getting a bad name again.
Well, yeah, yes, exactly. I mean, Champagne, it was only fairly recently that, the wine regions in France when you think about how long they've been making wine for, which is thousands and thousands of years, it was only fairly recently that you couldn't call a sparkling wine from Australia champagne. And that's because, they were going, the French were going, this is muck. Don't you dare call this champagne. It gives us a bad name, because also they could put anything they liked in it because there weren't the same regulations as there were in France. That's the reason that all of these regulations are now in place for
Right.
booze.
Okay.
Yeah.
I do think it's a lovely alternative, and it's an appointment to go and do something rather than just sitting and having cider in the pub in the sun. It does feel like a bit more of a event. And it reminds me of around 2000, like 2010s, when vintage was really in. And do you remember all these high tea places with burlesque? Like I just had so many nights out where we were drinking quaint cocktails in vintage teacups and then go and see burlesque. And it wasn't really about the drinking, it was about experience that kind of era.
You've hit the nail on the head. It is about the experience. Yes, I'd forgotten about that kind of burlesque sort of new period that we had. But also, prohibition has been back in, with the speakeasies and the rise of those. There are lots more of those in London that've got that lovely kind of cozy, velvety, old school vibe to it, which, something like absinthe makes you think of as well. Do you know Victor Wynn's Museum of Curiosities?
No.
It's all that weird Victorian and more modern stuff. They get donated things. So there are weird and slightly spooky things like two-headed piglets in a jar.
Love it.
Um, there is a jar of Amy Winehouse's poo. People have sent them jars of urine. There's a coffin. There's an open coffin in there with a skeleton of a lady that they've turned into a table, and for some reason, people just want to have sex on it. It's very odd. So many bonkers things in there. You should check it out on Instagram.
Well, I haven't been there, but I have recently seen some curiosities just down the road from you.
What? Where? At the Poo Museum?
Do you know what? I can't believe we've been so many times that I feel like we have done everything Isle of Wight, but we have not done that. And we were driving past it, and my eldest was like, "We forgot to go to the Poo Museum," and I was like, "Always leave something to come back to." But no, down the road from you in Arraton,
Mm.
there is the Shipwreck Centre, who has a real life, like, mummification, like mummy mermaid from the 1900s found in a shipwreck. But it does look a bit like a monkey was sewn to a fish. Having demonized this with the whole alcohol rhetoric, I do love how there's a respect for the mocktail and the importance of the botanical elements in it as well. You know, and it harks back to Alice Bethany and her tinctures and the benefits of that, and that can sit alongside just the whole alcohol element of the absinthe and that experience.
Yeah, I agree, and I must say, because she very kindly gave me a copy of their book, Spirits of Alchemy, and there are some gorgeous mocktail recipes in there that sort of bring in. They also sort of bring in crystals. There's one on, about the amethyst, because it used to be said that if you put an amethyst in your drink, you wouldn't get drunk. And yeah, and I really, and I really love how there are historical references, not just to the absinthe era, but there's a whole Greco-Roman thing which really appeals to me because, as you know, I'm pretty sure I used to be both of those things in previous life, and I'm doing a perfumery degree, and so, now I have the drink to go with it, and I'm going to base my final perfume on this kind of cocktail. Yeah, it's such a fascinating book. Not just like for non-drinkers as well as drinkers.
Yeah, and I love that it's kind of not exclusive then, is it? It doesn't, like, elbow out the non-drinkers, and that means a lot to probably a massive community.
Yeah.
But does that mean you have to, if you've got a recipe book for this kind of stuff, do you have to have all of those herbs on hand?
Well, you've got to have some of them. Yeah, it's the same with any cocktails. There's always something interesting that you don't have.
And do you improvise?
I improvise a hell of a lot, I must say, for that Greco-Roman one. I've actually bought all the ingredients now.
Well, it's part of your job, so you may as well. My husband goes mad when I improvise without, if we don't have one part of the recipe. He's like, "How could you? How could you?" And I'm like, "Well, just put something totally different in there. It will be fine."
I know what you mean. Hamish needs every single ingredient for every dish he's ever going to make as well. And I'm like, oh, can't you just use this? No, we need another packet of something that's going to sit there open with things spilling out of it because you needed a teaspoon and you bought 2 kilograms of it.
But I do love that though. I spent a week in your house recently cooking in there, and it was a treasure trove. It was amazing. But there was definitely something really basic I couldn't find. And I was like, fuck's sake, Hamish, could you not just have like molten salt?
Sure, we have that. But yeah, I've got all sorts of other shit, but not simple shit. This is true. Well, all of this is making me quite thirsty and hungry. I think I might go make myself some lunch and an absinthe cocktail because
An absinthe based lunch.
yeah.
Is quite a nice departure from just the British culture of necking a pint. So good on ya.
Good on you. Yes, thank you so much to Allison Crawbuck. Well worth checking out the distillery for distillery tours, as well as the Absinthe Parlour, which is just down the road, where you can see all of these amazing curiosities as well. And if you get the chance to hear Allison speak about it, there are some talks going on for the next couple of months. I thoroughly recommend going along.
And in the meantime, if you are new to us, please make sure you follow us at Slock and Hive on all the socials, and also check out the website where we take a deeper dive into everything we talk about, and sign up to our newsletter.
Yes, because in there you'll get all the little tidbits of the best things that have been going on during the last couple of weeks, and also the odd giveaway and competition, of course. Thank you all so much again for listening and for sharing the love and for telling us how much you're enjoying it. It really does mean the world to us. And don't forget, you can always let us know if you want to hear from certain people about certain things, or you want to come on the podcast yourself. Just drop us a line.
But for now, goodbye.
Bye bye.